I want to remind you, being December, we've got two very big services coming up. Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. They both fall on a Monday this year. We have a 7 p.m. service, our candlelight service on Christmas Eve, and then our burning bowl service on December 31st. Another great opportunity to invite somebody. As we all know, 80% of people who come to a congregation come because somebody suggested that they come. So be sure you pick up one of the business cards that we've got out there on the credenza, or we also have some more over in the fellowship hall. And just carry it with you, and sometimes you just have that serendipitous conversation with somebody, and you can give them the card. So good morning. There's a gentleman named Donald Tonde wrote an article about an experience he had many years ago. He and his family thought they'd go to France for the holidays. So they went to France, and the week was just one unpleasantness after another. Everything seemed to be going wrong. Christmas Eve, they come down to Nice, France, which is down on the Mediterranean Sea. They weren't feeling very Christmassy, and it was raining pretty much a day like today there in Nice, France, cold. They get to the hotel, it's not that great of a hotel, but that's what they booked. So they found a restaurant nearby. They come in just to get out of the rain, and the place just had kind of a low energy. There were only 5 tables that people were sitting at. There was a couple that you could tell from the language they spoke. He says there were 2 German couples, there were 2 French couples, and the one French couple had some children with them. And then he says, then off in the corner was a member of the American Navy. You could tell from the uniform. He says, and he was just writing, scribbling, really focused on writing a letter. And so they sat down, and his wife decided, well, let me order in French. So she ordered the meal for Phil, for her, and for their 3 children. And the food came out, and it was not what they ordered. And at first, Phil said he got upset because he thought maybe she ordered wrong, and she got teary-eyed, and it was just kind of, oh, brother. And then off at one of the other tables, the German woman is berating her husband, and then the French couple with some kids. The father's yelling at the one kid, and there's just this atmosphere that was not conducive with Christmas. And then the door opened, and there was a gust of wind that came in, and a woman who was just drenched came in. And she had a basket of flowers. It turns out she's a flower woman. So she kind of made the rounds of the tables, no takers. And so she sat down at one of the tables and started talking to the piano player, who was playing Christmas carols, but not with much energy or spirit. And she says, oh boy, Joseph, it's just one of those days. Nobody wants to buy flowers. And then he says, tell me about it. And he's pointing at the tip jar on top of the piano. There's nothing in it. And so the woman loudly says, well, I'll just have a bowl of soup. And she says, Christmas Eve and a bowl of soup. It's just that kind of a day. At that point, the sailor looked like he finished writing his letter and finished his meal, and he stood up, came over to the flower woman and said, how much for those 2 corsages? And she says, 2 francs. He ends up giving her 20 francs and kisses her on the cheek and says, Merry Christmas. And then he takes the 2 corsages and brings the one corsage over to Mr. Tonde's wife and gives it to her. And then he headed out. And the flower woman, as he headed out the door, got up and just started to dance. It's like, 20 francs. I don't believe it. And then she came over and gave Joseph a generous tip in his tip jar, and he started playing with some more energy the Christmas carols, and people started singing with him, and then other people started to stream in, and just the whole atmosphere just shifted. And it just shifted because one person decided to go contrary to what the energy of the room seemed to be. This American sailor. Here these people who were just feeling miserable and feeling just out of the spirit were affected because one person decided to take some action. So, sometimes the simplest of things can bring an inner peace to us. We're celebrating Advent. Now, as I said last week, some people may not really be familiar with Advent. It's a Christian tradition that started in the 400s. celebrated mainly by the Episcopal Church here in the United States and the Anglican Church, in England, although some Catholics and some other denominations celebrate it. But the idea is preparing yourself for the birth of the Christ. And of course, in Unity, we recognize the Christ is that divine nature that's within us that needs to be reborn every once in a while. So every year at Christmas time here in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, the sunlight starts to dwindle, the days are shorter, at least the daylight is shorter. And then we hit December 21st, or 22nd, depending upon where the leap year fell, and then it starts to get better. And then Christmas was placed 3 days after, since the pagans, quote unquote, celebrated the winter solstice. But the idea behind the Advent ritual is the idea of you've got these 4 candles for the 4 Sundays before Christmas, and then you've got the Christ candle in the middle. And our angels, very well done by Luis, talk about the 4 aspects that we celebrate as we're building to that new consciousness of Christ consciousness. For the first week, we talked about faith and generally the sense of hope that comes by allowing ourselves to feel that faith. And then this week, we're going to talk about peace. And then in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about, as you see up there, you've got love, and then joy is right before you. You see it's pink, so that's starting kind of like that. It looks like just as your sun is rising, and then the Christ candle in the middle. So Advent. Things can seem to be getting dark. All of us have had the experience of just something coming up that just discourages us. And yet, there's something within us that's ready to wash away that darkness. Often, as I mentioned, we'll have some new members joining us here a little bit later in the service. But in our membership orientation class, I often talk about family systems theory, and that all of us need to be aware that something happens in congregations. It doesn't matter what denomination you're in, and that is that congregations often seem to resemble a family, at least psychologically. And so what tends to happen is we want to heal our stuff that may have happened to us as children with our brothers and sisters or other kids or friends, things that happen to us with our authority figures, our parents, or those who were in authority in our lives. And so a lot of times in interactions in the congregation, there'll be this projection of something that's bothering you onto another person. And it's incumbent upon the rest of us to recognize when, hey, this doesn't seem to be about me, but maybe you need to have a healing. Wouldn't say that out loud, but usually, well, tell me more about what you're feeling. What happens is that we have this unmet need, like I said, an incident maybe that happened in the childhood. Maybe we just want validation. Maybe we just want to make sure that we're being heard or just venting what it is that we want to vent. And that can be a challenge to handle, when it seems to come out of the blue and throw you off. It's go, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting this. But if we're willing to embrace the conflict, we can perhaps dig a little bit deeper and figure out what that unmet need is. And it might be something that, like when I'm interacting with somebody, it might be something that I can't help you with, but I might know somebody who does. But at least now we've brought it to the surface, so we recognize the issue that needs to be healed. In the Gospel of Mark, 6th chapter, 47th verse, we're told that the 12 disciples were out in a boat. Jesus was alone on the land. The wind was against the disciples. And then the disciples saw Jesus walking on the sea, and they thought it was a ghost and cried out. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. In unity with these Bible stories, we look at the symbolism that's involved. The 12 disciples, of course, represent those 12 aspects of ourselves, 12 spiritual gifts, the 12 powers that we have. The boat, of course, is like many of us. We're out there sometimes on the sea. Sometimes it's a rough sea. The wind is in our face. So what's the storm in your life? What's going on for you, perhaps like right now, that you want to deal with? what happens is things often are not unfolding the way we think that we want them to. And when that happens, it's really important for us to remember that we don't have to be more spiritual. We're already spiritual beings having a human experience. So can we open our mind to the divine mind, the divine guidance that's always there? It's just so often we fall asleep to it. So let's awaken once again to that Christ mind and get the guidance as to what it is that we need to do. Can we think peace for ourselves and for others around us? So often, though, rather than being in the boat with 11 others, we're in the boat alone, and it can be scary. And sometimes we get into this attitude that we want to do it alone. We want to prove or achieve something. And I remember the 1992 My Cousin Vinny, in the movie with Joe Pesci as the Italian lawyer from New York, and one of his nephews gets arrested in Alabama, so he comes down to defend him. But throughout the movie, one of the themes is that Joe Pesci, the character Vinny, my cousin Vinny, wants to do it himself. And what he discovers through the course of the movie is that no, other people can help, and he needs help in various situations. So he opens to the idea that, yeah, he can get help from other people. So when those storms of daily life appear, there's nothing wrong with asking somebody else for help. And there's nothing wrong with asking God for help. Sometimes the most powerful and effective prayer we can say is, God, help! In 1969, a war broke out between the Central American countries of El Salvador and Honduras. It was interesting because for decades they had lived in peace. El Salvador is to the west, and Honduras is to the east. Honduras is about 5 times the size of El Salvador. Got great farmland, but not that many people. El Salvador had a lot of people, and so the people from El Salvador would migrate over to work the farms. And in Honduras, there was some political strife, so the leader of Honduras decided to stir things up a little bit. He started complaining about those immigrants that are coming across the border. Sound familiar? And just trying to make them the problem. And then suddenly this war breaks out along the border, and like, wait a minute, what happened? Turns out there was a soccer game between a Honduran team and a team from El Salvador. And there was a disputed call by the referee, which resulted in a goal being called. And there was all this arguing about who won the game, and suddenly a shooting war breaks out between these two countries. 3,000 people died. 300,000 were displaced. There's a Bible passage that's misunderstood and frankly abused in a lot of places, from Gospel of Matthew, 10th chapter, 34th verse. Jesus says to us, I come not to bring peace, but to bring a sword. This is symbolic. What Jesus, I believe, is saying here is that he brings a sword so that we can divide what is pleasant from what is unpleasant, what is right from what is not right. Complacency is often not right. Complacency, rather than us taking positive steps towards what it is we want to see created in the world. The Christ consciousness opens us up to infinite possibilities. In the evangelical end of the spectrum of Christianity, they talk a lot about accepting Christ. And accepting Christ, I believe, is symbolic of that opening our mind to the Christ mind. To face whatever challenge we have, especially during this Christmas time, where just so many people get so stressed out. So where's the challenge in your life? Are you having a health challenge? What about your relationships? Whether it's an intimate relationship or perhaps a coworker. What about employment? Are you having a challenge there? I was talking to someone at the first service, who just a few weeks ago lost his job. What about your spiritual connection? Are you feeling, do you feeling that you've somehow become disconnected from God? That's impossible, but sometimes we feel that way. Is there a problem with your home, or perhaps you're even homeless? What about money? Do you have enough money to pay all your bills in full and on time? These are all things that can stress us out and get us feeling like we're not getting the help that we need in our lives, or we're being unworthy. But if we're willing to open our mind to that divine mind, the divine ideas come through. The divine ideas that we can take action on. We know in our heart, we can feel intuitively, this is what it is that we need to do. So believe that there are divine ideas and then be willing to express them when they're very clear to you. Truth is, Jesus was the Prince of Peace, as they often say. But Jesus would go apart for a while and then come back. There are, of course, some traditions, especially in the East, of going and meditating in a cave for years at a time. But we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So Jesus would go off for 40 days. And of course, 40 represents as long as it took to get to that place where you needed to be. So we're willing to move from complacency and just be alert to the things that are ours to do. Conflict is an opportunity for healing. Peace is a choice, regardless of the circumstances, the environment. If I were to take one of these water glasses and start to turn it sideways, the water will come pouring out. But if I put my hand over the glass, it holds the water in. And so sometimes within us, when we're in a situation and we just feel the anger rising, there's the old adage, count to 10. Just take a nice deep breath and count to 10. And it's a good advice. Open your mind to the divine idea that might be perfect for you in that situation. Or maybe the proper response is, talk to me a little bit more about that, rather than just assuming that you know what someone's talking about. So, in the Gospel of John, 16th chapter, 33rd verse, Jesus speaks as a symbol of the Christ consciousness. And he says, I have said this to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Inner peace. When we open to that Christ consciousness, it can handle anything that's going on in our lives. And as I say often, when I have a situation come into my life that's just so unpleasant, can I take that deep breath, count to 10, and just say, okay, God, show me the good in this. Show me the good in this situation. Everything that comes into my life is an opportunity for spiritual growth. I'm going to have Duncan put up this week's takeaways. Conflict equals unmet needs. A lot of times there's just something that needs to be resolved. Be willing to ask for help from other people and from God. Open our minds to the divine mind and be willing to accept the Christ consciousness that's always there, always ready to help. Remember that peace is a choice, but the only true peace comes from within. As we sing so often, the peace song at the end of the service, let there be peace on earth, but let it begin with me. So Christmas is an opportunity for us to have the rebirth of light in our life. And light washes away darkness. In darkness, it's very hard to see anything. But when the light is there, everything becomes more clear. In the book of Job, 22nd chapter, 21st verse, the writer says, agree with God and be at peace. Thereby good will come to you. The difference between unity and other denominations is that a lot of denominations have been spending 2,000 years trying to explain why the guy that they thought was going to be their savior was nailed to a cross. They're trying to find meaning and significance in the death of Jesus. Where unity and some of our related denominations take the approach of like, no, wait a minute, what did he teach? It's what he taught that's important. So let's do our best to do what it is we need to do in the name and the nature and the power of Jesus Christ. Our video is from Steve Hartman of the CBS Evening News.